He died at 32. June 10th, 323 BC. Babylon, the greatest conqueror the world had ever seen, the man who had marched from Macedonia to India, who had destroyed the Persian Empire and carried Greek civilization to the edge of the known world, died in a palace that wasn't his, in a city he had conquered, surrounded by generals who would spend the next 40 years tearing his empire apart in a series of wars so brutal they would be known simply as the Wars of the Successors. He died of fever, most likely, or poison, depending on which ancient source you believe. His body racked with pain, his mind delirious, unable to speak in his final hours. When his commanders asked him who should inherit his empire, he supposedly whispered to the strongest, or maybe he said to one of his generals, or maybe he said nothing at all, and the sources invented the drama later. We'll never know. What we do know is that Alexander II, called the Great by history, died young, phenomenally young. At an age when most men are still finding their way in the world, still figuring out who they are and what they want, Alexander had already conquered everything. And his death broke the world. The empire he built disintegrated within months. His generals, the men who had fought beside him for 15 years, who had crossed deserts and mountains and rivers in his name, immediately began plotting against each other. His wife and his Persian wife were murdered. His infant son was used as a pawn and eventually killed. His half-brother Philip, mentally disabled and harmless, was proclaimed king and then murdered when he was no longer useful. His mother Olympias fought a desperate war to preserve her grandson's claim, and was eventually stoned to death by Macedonian soldiers. The Wars of the Successors would rage for 40 years, consuming hundreds of thousands of lives, until finally Alexander's empire settled into 3 major kingdoms: the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt, the Seleucid dynasty in Persia and the Near East, and the dynasty in Macedonia. These kingdoms would dominate the Mediterranean and Near East for centuries, creating what we call the Hellenistic Age, an era when Greek culture spread across the known world, when philosophy and science flourished, when cities like Alexandria became centers of learning. But they were fragments, pieces of what might have been, echoes of Alexander's vision distorted by the ambitions of lesser men. And so we ask the question that has haunted historians for 2,000 years. What if he hadn't died? What if the fever had broken, if the poison, if there was poison, had failed, if Alexander the Great had lived not to 32 but to 60? What if he had been given another 28 years to build, to consolidate, to pursue the dreams that died with him in Babylon? It is the ultimate historical counterfactual, a question that requires us to understand not just what Alexander did, but who he was, what drove him, what he wanted, what he might have become. And the answer, or answers, because history offers no certainties, reveals not just what the world lost when Alexander died young, but what it means to be human, to dream impossible dreams, to reach for immortality and find only mortality waiting. To understand what Alexander might have done with another 28 years, we must first understand where he was in 323 BC, what he had accomplished, what he was planning, what obsessed him in those final months before the fever struck. He had spent the winter in Babylon, the ancient capital of Mesopotamia, a city of legendary wealth and size that now served as one of the administrative centers of his vast empire. He was planning a new campaign. Sources suggest he intended to conquer Arabia, to subdue the tribes that controlled the incense routes and the coastline of the Persian Gulf. Beyond that, perhaps a campaign to the west against Carthage and Rome, cities he had heard of but never seen, powers growing on the far edge of the Mediterranean that might one day challenge Greek supremacy. But he was also doing something more interesting. He was trying to create something that had never existed before, a fusion empire, a state that would blend Greek and Persian cultures, that would unite East and West not through conquest alone, but through integration, through the creation of a new civilization that was neither purely Macedonian nor purely Persian, but something unprecedented. It was a radical vision. His Macedonian nobles hated it. They had not marched 10,000 miles and fought 100 battles to see Alexander dress in Persian robes, marry Persian princesses, and adopt Persian court ceremonies. They were conquerors, not diplomats. They wanted to rule the Persians, not become them. But Alexander saw something they didn't. He understood that conquest is easy compared to governance, that you can defeat an empire in battle, but you cannot rule it through force alone, that the Persian Empire had lasted for 200 years not because it was militarily invincible. Alexander had proven it wasn't, but because it had learned to accommodate its subject peoples, to allow local customs and religions to continue, to rule through a light touch rather than an iron fist. So Alexander adopted Persian dress. He married a Bactrian princess, and then daughter of the last Persian emperor. He encouraged his generals to marry Persian, famously hosting a mass wedding at Susa where 90 of his officers married Persian brides in a single ceremony. He recruited Persian soldiers into his army, not as auxiliaries but as equals to his Macedonians. He appointed Persians to positions of authority. He paid honor to Persian gods and Persian customs. And his Macedonian veterans were furious. At just months before his death, thousands of his soldiers refused orders, demanding to be sent home, accusing Alexander of abandoning his own people in favor of barbarians. It could have been the end of everything. A lesser man would have been overthrown right there, killed by his own troops. Alexander's response was characteristic. He executed the ringleaders. Then he announced that, fine, he would send them all home, and he would replace them with Persians. He would create a Persian army, led by Persian generals, and the Macedonians could go back to their farms and their villages, and watch as everything they had conquered slipped from their grasp. It was a bluff, but it was a brilliant bluff. The army broke. The soldiers wept and begged forgiveness. Alexander granted it and then held a feast, a reconciliation banquet where 9,000 people sat together, Greeks and Persians side by side, while Alexander prayed to the gods for harmony between the races and partnership in the empire. It was a stunning moment, a glimpse of what Alexander wanted to create, not just an empire but a new world, a cosmopolitan civilization where the boundaries between Greek and Persian, between West and East, would blur and eventually disappear. But 3 months later he was dead, and that vision died with him. So what if it hadn't? What if Alexander had lived to 60, ruling his empire for another 28 years? The first question is, would the empire have held together? This is not a given. Alexander's empire was enormous, stretching from Greece to India, from Egypt to Central Asia. It encompassed dozens of different peoples, speaking hundreds of languages, worshipping thousands of gods. It had been conquered in just over a decade, and it had barely begun to be administered. The Persians had needed 2 centuries to build the administrative infrastructure to govern such a territory. Alexander had conquered it in 10 years and had spent the next 3 years fighting rebellions, suppressing resistance, and trying to impose some kind of order on the chaos. He had appointed governors, established colonies, created new cities. By the time of his death, he had founded some 20 cities, most of them named Alexandria, meant to serve as centers of Greek culture and military garrisons to hold the territory. But it wasn't enough, not nearly enough. The empire was held together primarily by Alexander's personal authority, by the loyalty of his army, by the sheer momentum of conquest. If he had lived, he would have faced the same challenge every empire builder faces: how to transform military conquest into stable governance. And Alexander, for all his genius on the battlefield, was still learning how to govern. He was only 32. He had spent most of his adult life at war. He had never ruled during peacetime. He had never had to deal with the mundane, grinding work of administration, tax collection, legal systems, infrastructure maintenance, managing a bureaucracy. But if he had lived, he would have learned. Alexander was many things: brilliant, ruthless, visionary, cruel. But he was not stupid. He learned quickly. He adapted. He took the best ideas from every culture he encountered and incorporated them into his own methods. So picture this: Alexander at 40, at 50, at 60. Not the young conqueror forever frozen at 32, but a mature ruler with decades of experience. What might he have built? The first priority would have been consolidation. No more conquests, not immediately. The empire was already too large, too unwieldy. Alexander would have needed to spend years, perhaps a decade, establishing real administrative control over what he had already conquered. He would have built roads. The Romans are famous for their roads, but Alexander understood their importance too. He would have created a network of paved highways connecting Egypt to Persia, Persia to India, facilitating trade and troop movement. He would have standardized weights and measures, created a common currency, established a postal system, all the boring, practical infrastructure that empires need to function. He would have built more cities, dozens, perhaps hundreds, not just military outposts but real cities, centers of commerce and culture, populated by Greek colonists and native peoples living side by side. These cities would have been nodes in a network spanning the known world, spreading Greek language and culture, but also absorbing local influences, creating that fusion civilization he dreamed of. And he would have needed to address the succession. This was the great failure of Alexander's actual reign. He died without a clear heir, without establishing a system for passing power to the next generation. If he had lived to 60, he would have had children, Not the infant son who was murdered after his death, but grown men and women, educated in both Greek and Persian traditions, prepared to rule. Perhaps he would have divided the empire among his sons, creating a system of regional kingdoms under overall Macedonian supremacy. Perhaps he would have established a hereditary monarchy with clear rules of succession. Perhaps he would have created something entirely new, a council of kings, a federal system, something adapted from the various political systems he had encountered in his conquests. We cannot know, but Alexander was a student of Aristotle, a man who had thought deeply about politics and governance. Given time, given the chance to build rather than just conquer, he might have created something remarkable. But Alexander was not content with what he had. Even in his final months, he was planning new conquests: Arabia, Carthage, Rome. The sources are unclear about his exact plans, but they agree on one thing: he was not finished. And this is where our counterfactual becomes truly speculative. Because if Alexander had lived, if he had consolidated his empire and secured the succession, would he have stopped there? Or would he have continued to reach for more? The man who wept when he thought there were no more worlds to conquer. This is probably apocryphal, but it captures something true about Alexander's psychology. Would he have been content to rule what he had? Or would the old hunger have returned, the need to prove himself, to accomplish what no one else had accomplished? Consider Alexander at 45, his empire secure, his sons growing to adulthood, his administrative reforms in place. What does he do? Does he settle into comfortable middle age, managing his empire, building monuments to his own glory? Or does he look west, toward territories he had never seen, toward Rome and Carthage, toward the Celtic tribes of Gaul and the mysterious lands beyond? Rome in 323 BC was not the Rome of Caesar. It was a regional power in central Italy, fighting the Samnites for control of the peninsula, still decades away from dominating even Italy, let alone the Mediterranean. If Alexander had marched west with his veteran army, the men who had defeated the Persian Empire and conquered Central Asia, Rome would have fallen. Easily. Completely. Would it have mattered? Would conquering Rome have changed history, or would it have been just another city added to Alexander's list of conquests, forgotten in the vastness of his empire? We tend to think of Rome as inevitable, as destined to rule the Mediterranean. But destiny is a myth we create looking backward. At the time, Rome was just one Italian city-state among many. If Alexander had destroyed it in 320 BC, Western history would have unfolded completely differently. No Roman Republic, no Roman Empire, no Latin language spreading across Europe, no legal traditions, no engineering marvels, no cultural legacy that would shape European civilization for 2,000 years. Instead, a Greek-Persian empire dominating not just the East but the West as well. Greek, not Latin, as the lingua franca of Europe. Alexandria in Egypt, not Rome in Italy, as the center of Western civilization. The whole course of European history bent in a different direction. But conquest brings its own problems. And Alexander, if he had lived, would have confronted them with the same intensity he brought to everything else. The challenge of ruling an empire that spans 3 continents is not just administrative. It's cultural, it's philosophical, it's deeply personal. Every decision Alexander made about how to govern, whom to trust, how to balance competing interests, would have rippled across millions of lives and shaped the future of civilization. Consider the question of language. Alexander's conquest spread Greek across the known world, creating what we call Koine Greek, the common dialect that became the lingua franca of the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East. This is the Greek in which the New Testament would eventually be written, the language of science and philosophy for centuries. But in Alexander's lifetime, Greek was still the language of conquerors, imposed on subject peoples who resented it. If Alexander had lived, if he had truly pursued his vision of a fusion empire, he might have created something unprecedented, a bilingual civilization, Greek and Persian both recognized as official languages, court ceremonies conducted in both tongues, children of the elite educated in both cultures. Imagine the literary and philosophical cross-pollination that might have resulted: Greek logic and Persian poetry, Aristotelian science and Zoroastrian theology, creating new forms of thought that synthesized East and West. This wasn't impossible. It had antecedents. The Persian Empire itself had been multilingual, conducting business in Aramaic, Old Persian, and other languages depending on the region. Alexander understood this. He had kept much of the Persian administrative system intact precisely because it worked. If given time, he might have formalized this bilingualism, creating an official policy that recognized both Greek and Persian cultures as equal partners in the empire. But his Macedonian nobles would have resisted every step of the way. And this brings us to one of the central tensions of Alexander's reign, the conflict between his cosmopolitan vision and the narrow nationalism of his own people. The Macedonians who followed Alexander were not philosophers. They were warriors, mostly from the landed aristocracy of a small kingdom in northern Greece. They had grown up believing that Greeks were superior to barbarians, that conquest meant domination, that the spoils of war belonged to the victors. They had not signed up for cultural fusion. They wanted to rule the Persians, not share power with them. This tension exploded repeatedly during Alexander's lifetime. At the mass wedding in Susa, where Alexander forced his officers to marry Persian women, many of the Macedonian grooms divorced their new wives as soon as Alexander's attention was elsewhere. At the army rather than accept Persian soldiers as equals. Even Alexander's closest friends criticized his adoption of Persian dress and customs, seeing it as a betrayal of Greek identity. If Alexander had lived to 60, this conflict would not have disappeared. If anything, it would have intensified. Every Persian appointed to a position of authority would have been resented by Macedonian nobles who felt passed over. Every concession to Persian customs would have been seen as a slight to Greek culture. Every mixed marriage, every bilingual decree, every fusion of traditions would have generated resistance. Alexander would have had to fight his own people as much as he fought external enemies. And the question is, would he have won? The historical Alexander dealt with resistance through a combination of charisma, intimidation, and occasional violence. He executed generals who opposed him too openly. He sent troublemakers on dangerous missions where they might conveniently die. He used his personal magnetism to win over skeptics, and his reputation for invincibility to cow the rest into submission. But charisma fades with age. The young conqueror who could inspire men to follow him anywhere becomes the middle-aged administrator making compromises and cutting deals. The warrior king who led from the front becomes the emperor who rules from a palace. Would Alexander at 50 have commanded the same loyalty as Alexander at 30? Perhaps, if he had continued to deliver results, if the empire had prospered, if the fusion of cultures had created wealth and stability, if his subjects had seen their lives improve under his rule, then perhaps the resistance would have faded. Perhaps a new generation would have grown up accepting the fusion empire as normal, unable to imagine the old world of purely Greek or purely Persian identities. Or perhaps not. Perhaps the tensions would have escalated into civil war, with conservative Macedonians in Greece rising in rebellion against an emperor they saw as having gone native, while Persians in the east revolted against a ruler they still saw as a foreign conqueror despite his Persian dress and Persian wives. Empire building is a tightrope walk. And Alexander, brilliant as he was walking that tightrope without a safety net. But let's assume the best case. Let's assume Alexander managed to consolidate his empire, to create the administrative infrastructure needed to govern it, to balance the competing interests of Greeks and Persians, to establish a clear succession. What then? What would the world have looked like with a stable, enduring Alexander empire stretching from Greece to India? First, consider the economic implications. Alexander's empire controlled the major trade routes of the ancient world: the Silk Road connecting China to the Mediterranean, the maritime routes of the Indian Ocean, the land routes through Persia and Mesopotamia. If these routes had been unified under a single political authority, if merchants could travel from Athens to the borders of China without crossing hostile frontiers, the economic growth would have been staggering. We see hints of this in the Hellenistic period that followed Alexander's death. Even with the empire fragmented, even with the successor kingdoms fighting each other, trade flourished. Greek merchants reached India and beyond. Ideas and technologies flowed along the trade routes, Indian mathematics reaching Greece, Greek astronomy reaching India, Chinese silk reaching the Mediterranean. But these exchanges were limited by political fragmentation. Merchants had to navigate multiple kingdoms, pay multiple sets of tariffs, deal with different legal systems and currencies. A unified empire would have eliminated these barriers. Imagine a common currency from Egypt to Afghanistan, a single legal code governing contracts and property rights across the entire territory, roads and ports maintained by imperial authorities, safe from bandits and pirates. The wealth generated by this trade would have transformed the ancient world. Cities would have grown larger, more cosmopolitan. Alexandria in Egypt would have become not just a regional capital but a global metropolis, drawing merchants and scholars from across 3 continents. New cities would have sprung up along the trade routes, in Bactria, in the Indus Valley, becoming centers of commerce and culture. And with wealth comes culture. The Hellenistic age, even in our fragmented timeline, saw an explosion of art, literature, philosophy, and science. The Library of Alexandria, the mathematical works of Euclid, the engineering of Archimedes, the astronomy of Aristarchus, who proposed a heliocentric model of the solar system 17 centuries before. All of this emerged from the cultural ferment of the post-Alexander world. Now multiply that by a factor of 10. Imagine Greek philosophers engaging directly with Indian Buddhist thinkers, not through third-hand reports, but through sustained intellectual exchange. Imagine Persian engineers working alongside Greek mathematicians on irrigation projects and city planning. Imagine the artistic traditions of Greece and Persia and India influencing each other, creating new forms of sculpture and architecture and painting. We got a taste of this fusion in the Greco-Buddhist art of, where Greek sculptural techniques were applied to Buddhist religious subjects, creating statues of the Buddha that looked like Greek gods. If Alexander's empire had endured, this kind of cross-pollination would have occurred across every domain of culture: religion, philosophy, art, science, literature. The result would have been a civilization richer and more sophisticated than anything the ancient world actually produced. A true world civilization, drawing on the best of multiple traditions, creating something new and unprecedented. But there would have been a dark side as well, because Alexander, for all his vision and brilliance, was also a conqueror, a man who had ordered the massacre of cities that resisted him, who had prisoners and burned temples, who had killed friends in drunken rages and executed generals on trumped-up charges of treason. Power corrupts, they say, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Alexander at 32 already showed signs of megalomania, demanding that people prostrate themselves before him in the Persian fashion, claiming descent from the gods, becoming increasingly paranoid about plots and conspiracies. What would Alexander at 60 have become? After decades of unchallenged power, surrounded by sycophants, isolated in a palace, with no one left who could speak truth to him, would he have become a monster? The historical precedents are not encouraging. Augustus managed to rule Rome for 40 years without descending into tyranny, but he was exceptional. Most autocrats who rule for decades become increasingly paranoid, increasingly cruel, increasingly divorced from reality. The power to make life and death decisions over millions of people, with no checks, no accountability, no one to tell you no, it changes you. It has to. Alexander might have built a magnificent civilization, but he also might have drowned it in blood. Mass executions of suspected traitors, purges of the administration, increasingly bizarre demands and edicts. The kind of behavior we see in aging autocrats throughout history, from Nero to men who started with grand visions and ended as tyrants. And the succession, even if Alexander had sons, even if he had established a clear line of inheritance, there's no guarantee it would have held. His sons would have been half Greek, half Persian. Would the Macedonians have accepted them? Would the Persians? Or would Alexander's death, whenever it came, have triggered the same civil war that actually occurred, just delayed by a few decades? History suggests that empires built by a single charismatic leader rarely survive that leader's death intact. Alexander's actual empire fragmented immediately. Rome went through a century of civil wars before Augustus established the Principate. Charlemagne's empire split among his grandsons. Khan's empire fractured within decades of his death. The problem is that personal authority cannot be institutionalized. You can't create a bureaucracy that replicates a genius's decision-making. You can't pass charisma to your children through inheritance. And you can't prevent ambitious generals and governors from calculating their chances in a succession struggle. So even in our best-case scenario, Alexander consolidating his empire, creating a fusion civilization, establishing a prosperous and culturally vibrant world state, there would have been a ticking clock. How long could it last? 1 generation? 2? At some point, probably sooner rather than later, the empire would have fractured. But the pieces would have been different from the historical Hellenistic kingdoms. They would have been more integrated, more truly fusion states rather than Greek kingdoms ruling over Persian subjects. The cultural and economic connections would have been deeper, harder to sever. And the memory of Alexander's united empire would have created a precedent, an ideal, something for future rulers to aspire to reconstitute. Much as the memory of Rome would haunt Europe for 1,000 years after the Western Empire fell, with Charlemagne and Otto and Napoleon all trying to recreate it, so too the memory of Alexander's world empire might have shaped the ambitions of rulers for centuries. And what about India? This is one of the most tantalizing might-have-beens of Alexander's story. In the actual timeline, Alexander invaded India in 326 BC. He crossed the Indus River, defeated the local king in battle, and prepared to push further east toward the Ganges and the rich kingdoms of the Indian heartland. But his army refused. They had been marching and fighting for 8 years. They were exhausted. They wanted to go home. And for once, Alexander listened. He turned back, marching south down the Indus to the sea, then west across the desert back to Persia. It was a painful retreat. The army suffered terribly crossing the desert. Thousands died of thirst and heat. It was one of the few clear failures of Alexander's career, a logistical disaster born of hubris and poor planning. But what if his army hadn't? What if they had pushed on to the Ganges? What if Alexander had conquered the great kingdoms of northern India, with its capital at Pataliputra, one of the largest cities in the ancient world? The military question is open. The Indian kingdoms fielded massive armies, including war elephants far more numerous than anything Alexander had faced before. The Nanda dynasty that ruled supposedly could field an army of 200,000 infantry and 20,000 cavalry. Even allowing for ancient sources exaggerating numbers, these were formidable forces. Alexander might have won. His tactical brilliance and the discipline of his Macedonian phalanx had overcome every opponent he had faced. But the campaign would have been long, bloody, and exhausting. And even if he had won, holding India would have been nearly impossible. India was too large, too populous, too culturally distinct. The religious traditions, Hinduism, Jainism, the emerging Buddhism, were fundamentally different from anything in the Greek or Persian worlds. The social structures, the caste system, the village-based agriculture, the monsoon climate, everything about India was alien to the Macedonians and Persians. Alexander might have conquered it, but he could not have held it, not permanently. India would have been the empire's eastern frontier, a constant source of rebellion and unrest, requiring massive garrisons and endless military campaigns to suppress. Unless, and here's the interesting counterfactual, Alexander had taken the same approach he took with Persia, adopting Indian customs, marrying Indian princesses, recruiting Indian soldiers, creating a triple fusion of Greek, Persian, and Indian cultures. This seems far-fetched, but remember, Alexander was only 30 when he invaded India. If he had lived to 60, he would have had 3 decades to work on integrating India into his empire. 3 decades for Greek and Indian philosophers to exchange ideas, for trade to create economic interdependence, for a new generation to grow up unable to imagine the separate worlds their parents knew. The cultural implications are staggering. Greek philosophy meeting Indian Buddhism at the height of both traditions. Plato and Aristotle in dialogue with the Buddha and the thinkers. Mathematics, Greek geometry combined with Indian arithmetic, including the concept of zero, which India would develop in the centuries after Alexander. In our timeline, these exchanges happened slowly, over centuries, through intermediaries. Buddhist ideas filtered into the Hellenistic world gradually. Indian mathematics reached Europe through Arabic intermediaries 1,000 years later. But in a world where Alexander's empire spanned from Greece to the Ganges, where scholars could travel freely across that entire distance, where royal patronage encouraged intellectual exchange, the pace would have accelerated dramatically. We might have seen universities emerging centuries earlier, institutions drawing scholars from 3 continents to study together. We might have seen a scientific revolution a millennium before it actually occurred, as Greek experimental methods combined with Indian mathematical sophistication and Persian astronomical observations. Or we might have seen nothing of the kind. Cultural exchange is not automatic. It requires the right conditions: peace, prosperity, tolerance, institutional support. And it faces resistance from those who see their traditional ways threatened by foreign ideas. The outcome would have depended entirely on Alexander's choices, on whether he could create the conditions for genuine cultural synthesis, or whether his empire would have remained a Greek military occupation of conquered territories, extracting wealth but giving little in return. But let us return to the West, because if Alexander had lived, if he had consolidated his Eastern Empire and secured his succession, there is one conquest that might have obsessed him above all others: Rome. We know Alexander was fascinated by the West. He had heard reports of Rome, of Carthage, of the Celtic tribes in Gaul and beyond. These were lands he had never seen, peoples he had never conquered. And for a man who believed himself descended from Achilles and Heracles, who saw his life as an epic quest to surpass every hero who came before him, the unconquered West would have been an irresistible lure. Imagine Alexander at 50, his Eastern Empire stable, his sons educated and prepared to govern, his administrative reforms in place. He would have been restless. The life of a bureaucrat emperor, however necessary, would have chafed at a man who had spent his youth leading cavalry charges and storming city walls. He would have wanted one more campaign, one more conquest to cement his legacy. And Rome, small, aggressive, expansionist Rome, would have been the perfect target. In 300 BC, roughly the time Alexander would have been launching a Western campaign if he had lived, Rome was still fighting for control of Italy. The Samnite Wars were grinding on, brutal mountain conflicts that tested Roman determination. Rome had not yet conquered the Greek cities of southern Italy, had not yet fought Carthage, had not yet become the Mediterranean power we remember. Alexander, arriving with an army of Macedonian veterans and Persian cavalry and Indian war elephants, would have crushed them. There is no other word for it. The Roman legion was formidable, but it was designed for the warfare of Italy, close-order infantry combat in the hills and valleys of the peninsula. It was not designed to face the combined arms tactics Alexander had perfected over 15 years of campaigning. The Macedonian phalanx would have pinned the Roman line in place. The companion cavalry would have swept around the flanks, shattering Roman formations. The Persian horse archers would have harassed and demoralized. The elephants, Rome had never faced war elephants, and their psychological impact would have been devastating. Rome would have fallen, probably in a single campaign season, and the entire trajectory of Western history would have changed. No Roman conquest of the Mediterranean, no Punic Wars, no Julius Caesar, no Roman Empire. The legal traditions, the engineering achievements, the Latin language, all the foundations of Western civilization as we know it, would never have emerged. But something else would have taken their place. Alexander would not have destroyed Rome and walked away. He would have incorporated it into his empire, rebuilt it as a Hellenistic city, populated it with Greek colonists and Roman natives living side by side. He would have extended his road network across Italy, built harbors for his fleet, established military colonies to hold the territory. And then he would have continued west, to Carthage, to Spain, to Gaul, perhaps even to Britain, following in the footsteps of his father who had campaigned in the Balkans, extending Greek civilization to the Atlantic Ocean. The Western Mediterranean would have become Greek. Latin might have survived as a local dialect, the way Aramaic survived in the Near East, but the dominant language would have been Greek. The dominant culture would have been Hellenistic. The cities would have been built in the Greek style, with theaters and gymnasiums and temples to Greek gods. Europe as we know it, Latin Europe, Roman Catholic Europe, the Europe of Romance languages and Roman law, would never have existed. In its place, a Greek Europe, an Orthodox Europe perhaps, though Christianity itself might never have emerged in the form we know it. Because Christianity was a product of specific historical circumstances. It emerged from Judaism in Roman-occupied Palestine, spread through the Roman Empire using Roman roads and Roman peace, was eventually adopted by Roman emperors as the official religion. The entire structure of Christianity, its organization, its theology, its relationship with political power, was shaped by the Roman context. In an Alexander-dominated world, The Jewish communities of the Near East would have existed under very different conditions, perhaps more integrated into Greek culture through Alexander's fusion policies, perhaps more isolated and resistant, maintaining their distinctiveness in opposition to Hellenistic syncretism. And Jesus of Nazareth, if he had existed at all in this alternate timeline, would have been a very different figure, a Jewish teacher in a Hellenistic world rather than a Roman one. His message shaped by different political realities, his followers spreading his teachings through different channels, in a different language, to different audiences. Perhaps Christianity would never have emerged as a world religion at all. Perhaps Judaism would have remained one tradition among many in a religiously diverse empire, with Greek philosophy and Persian Zoroastrianism and Indian Buddhism all coexisting and influencing each other, creating new syncretic religions we cannot even imagine. Or perhaps Alexander himself would have become, his cult growing into a new religion. This was already happening during his lifetime. He was as a god in some of the cities he founded. If he had lived to 60, if he had continued to accomplish miracles of conquest and administration, if he had presided over an era of unprecedented prosperity and cultural flourishing, his cult might have grown to rival any other faith. Imagine temples to the divine Alexander stretching from Spain to India, prayers offered to the God-King who united the world, a religion built around the worship of human excellence and achievement, celebrating the heroic ideal that Alexander embodied. It's not so far-fetched. The Romans, their emperors. The Egyptians had their pharaohs as gods for thousands of years. Why not Alexander? But empires, however mighty, are built by human beings, and human beings age, sicken, and die. Alexander at 60 would have been old by ancient standards. Life expectancy for those who survived childhood was better than we often think. Romans and Greeks who made it to adulthood could expect to live into their 60s or 70s if they avoided violence and disease. But they were not healthy by modern standards. Chronic illnesses, old wounds, the accumulated damage of decades of hard living, all of this would have taken its toll. Alexander in particular had been wounded many times. An arrow through the lung in India, a sword slashed to the head, countless lesser injuries accumulated over years of frontline combat. These wounds would have left him with chronic pain, breathing difficulties, perhaps neurological problems. The fever that killed him at 32 might have been malaria, which means he could have suffered recurring bouts of the disease for the rest of his life. And there was the drinking. Alexander was a legendary drinker even in a culture where heavy drinking was normal. The banquet where he killed his friend in a drunken rage. The all-night drinking parties in Babylon. The sources are unanimous that Alexander drank heavily, and some modern scholars have speculated that alcohol-related illness might have contributed to his death. If he had lived to 60, the cumulative effects of decades of heavy drinking would have been severe. Liver disease, certainly. Perhaps cognitive decline. The sharp mind that could analyze a battlefield at a glance and devise brilliant tactics might have become clouded, unreliable, prone to poor judgment. So picture Alexander in his final years. Still emperor, still theoretically in control of the vast territories he had conquered, but increasingly frail, increasingly dependent on advisors and administrators to handle the day-to-day work of governance. Perhaps lucid some days, confused others, perhaps retreating into memories of past glories, living more in the world of his youth than in the present. His sons, and he would have had several by now from different wives, would have been circling like sharks, each building coalitions of support, preparing for the inevitable succession struggle. The Persians would have backed one candidate, the Macedonians another. Regional governors would have calculated which horse to bet on. The unity Alexander had imposed through force of personality would have begun to fray. And when he finally died, from disease, from old wounds, from the simple accumulation of years, the empire would have exploded into civil war. Not immediately, perhaps. If Alexander had been wise, if he had designated a clear successor and built consensus around that choice, there might have been a peaceful transition. But the historical odds are against it. Too many competing interests, too much wealth and power at stake, too many ambitious men who believed they deserved the throne more than Alexander's chosen heir. The wars of the successors would have happened anyway, just later, just after Alexander had built more, achieved more, created more that could be destroyed in the fighting. So what, in the end, is the answer to our question? What if Alexander had lived to 60? The honest answer is, we cannot know. History is not a laboratory where we can run controlled experiments. Too many variables, too many individual choices that could swing outcomes in wildly different directions. The future is not determined by the past. It is created by human beings making decisions in the present, and those decisions are shaped by circumstances we can barely predict even when we're living through them. But we can sketch possibilities. We can imagine worlds that might have been, understanding that they are speculations, counterfactuals, thought experiments rather than predictions. In the best case, Alexander might have created a true world empire, a fusion civilization that united Greek, Persian, and Indian cultures, a period of unprecedented cultural exchange and economic prosperity, roads and trade routes connecting 3 continents, cities becoming cosmopolitan centers where scholars from different traditions worked together, where merchants grew wealthy on long-distance trade, where ordinary people lived better lives than their ancestors could have imagined. Mathematics and science advancing centuries earlier, philosophy and religion cross-pollinating in productive ways, art and architecture drawing on multiple traditions, a genuine world civilization, the first in history, creating achievements that would have dwarfed anything the actual ancient world produced. And then, when Alexander died, a fracturing, but perhaps not a complete collapse. Perhaps the empire would have split into regional kingdoms that maintained the fusion culture, that continued to trade and exchange ideas, that remembered they were all part of something larger. Perhaps the Hellenistic age would have been even richer, even more culturally productive, because the foundation Alexander built would have been so much stronger. In the worst case, Alexander's empire would have been a house of cards. The tensions between Greeks and Persians would have erupted into open conflict. The conquered peoples would have rebelled. The administrative system would have collapsed under the weight of corruption and incompetence. And when Alexander died, His sons would have torn the empire apart in wars even bloodier than the historical wars of the successors. Rome, unconquered in this timeline, would have risen to fill the power vacuum in the West. The Mauryan Empire in India, perhaps strengthened by the absence of Greek interference, would have dominated the East, and the Near East would have fragmented into warring kingdoms, much as it actually did, but with even more destruction and suffering. The most likely scenario is somewhere in between. Alexander would have achieved some of his goals, failed at others. The empire would have been more stable than it was under the successors, but less stable than a true world state. Cultural exchange would have happened, but incompletely, with as much resistance as acceptance. And when the empire finally fragmented, it would have left behind a mixed legacy, some achievements worth preserving, some disasters worth avoiding. Much like the real Alexander, in other words. Neither the god-king of legend nor the brutal conqueror of modern revisionist history, but a human being, brilliant and flawed, visionary and cruel, capable of genuine greatness and genuine monstrosity, sometimes in the same breath. We are drawn to Alexander because he represents something fundamental in human nature. The desire to transcend limits, to achieve the impossible, to leave a mark on the world so deep that it can never be erased. He conquered more territory in 13 years than most empires manage in centuries. He spread Greek culture across the known world. He defeated the Persian Empire, which had seemed invincible. He marched his army to the edge of the world and would have gone farther if his men had let him. And he died at 32, his work unfinished, his vision unrealized. We cannot help but wonder, what if? What if he had lived? What if he had been given time to build instead of just to conquer? What might he have created? The answer matters because it speaks to the contingency of history, to the fact that individual lives make a difference, that the course of civilization can turn on whether one person lives or dies, whether one decision is made or not made, whether one arrow finds its mark or flies wide. If Alexander had lived to 60, the world would be different. How different we cannot say, but different, different perhaps. A world where Greek is spoken from Spain to India, where Buddhism and Stoicism influence each other from their inception, where Rome never becomes Rome, where Christianity never becomes Christianity, where the entire foundation of Western civilization is built on different materials, arranged in different patterns, creating different structures. Or perhaps not. Perhaps the deep forces that shape history, geography, economics, technology, the aggregated choices of millions of people, would have asserted themselves regardless of what one man did. Perhaps Alexander's empire would have collapsed anyway. Perhaps Rome would have risen anyway. Perhaps the basic trajectory of history would have been the same, just with different details. We cannot know, and that is precisely what makes the question compelling. Because in asking what if Alexander had lived, we are really asking a deeper question. Does individual action matter? Can one person change the course of history? Or are we all just acting out roles in a story whose ending is already written? Alexander believed he mattered. He believed he was creating something new, something that would endure. He was wrong, at least in the specific ways he imagined. His empire fragmented within months of his death. But he was also right. The Hellenistic civilization he created lasted for centuries. The cities he founded endured. The cultural exchange he initiated continued. Greek became the language of the Eastern Mediterranean for 1,000 years. The fusion of cultures he began shaped the development of Christianity, of Islamic civilization, of the entire course of Mediterranean and Near Eastern history. He mattered, just not in the way he expected. So here is what Alexander might have accomplished if he had lived to 60. He might have built a real administrative system for his empire, creating the bureaucracy and infrastructure needed to govern such vast territories, roads and postal systems, standardized weights and measures, a common currency, legal codes that blended Greek and Persian traditions, the boring, practical work of empire building that gets forgotten in the excitement of conquest. He might have established a lasting dynasty, with his sons educated to rule a multicultural empire, prepared to balance competing interests and maintain the delicate fusion he had created. He might have continued his conquests westward, destroying Rome before it could become Rome, extending Greek civilization to the Atlantic Ocean, fundamentally altering the trajectory of European history. He might have integrated India more fully into his empire, creating a true transcontinental civilization that united the Greek, Persian, and Indian worlds in ways that would have revolutionized art, science, philosophy, and religion. He might have presided over an era of unprecedented cultural flourishing, as the greatest minds from multiple civilizations worked together, exchanged ideas, built on each other's achievements. We might have seen the scientific revolution a millennium early. We might have seen artistic and philosophical achievements that would have dwarfed anything the actual ancient world produced. Or he might have become a monster, an aging tyrant, increasingly paranoid, drowning his empire in blood and oppression. His sons might have turned on each other in fratricidal wars that made the wars of the successors look tame. His empire might have collapsed even before his death, tearing itself apart under the weight of its own contradictions. We cannot know which Alexander we would have gotten, the builder or the destroyer, the philosopher king or the tyrant, the visionary or the madman. Perhaps we would have gotten all of them. Perhaps Alexander at 60 would have been as contradictory as Alexander at 32, capable of brilliant administration one day and senseless violence the next, generous and cruel, visionary and petty, human, in all the messy complexity that implies. Stand in the ruins of Persepolis today, the Persian capital Alexander burned. Or visit Alexandria in Egypt, the city he founded that became the intellectual capital of the ancient world. Or walk the streets of Samarkand in Uzbekistan, where Alexander married, where East met West in his vision of a united world. These places still exist. They carry the memory of Alexander, faint but persistent, a ghost of what was and what might have been. We cannot bring Alexander back. We cannot give him the 30 years he was. We cannot see what he would have built with those years, what he would have created or destroyed. But we can learn from his story, from what he accomplished and what he failed to accomplish, from the dreams he pursued and the price he paid for pursuing them. He believed he could unite the world. He believed he could transcend the limitations that bound lesser men. He believed he was destined for immortality. He was wrong about the immortality. He died like everyone else, his body failing him despite all his achievements. But he was right about one thing. He changed the world. The world we live in now, 2,000 years after his death, is still shaped by what he did in his brief, brilliant, terrible life. And if he had lived to 60, the world would have been shaped even more profoundly. For better or worse, and probably both, Alexander would have left a mark so deep that we cannot even imagine what might have grown from it. That is the tragedy and the mystery of history. We cannot replay it. We cannot test our theories. We can only look at what happened and wonder about what might have been. Alexander the Great died at 32, and the world turned down a path we will never travel, toward a destination we will never see. But in asking the question, in imagining the world that might have been, we learn something about ourselves, about our own choices, about the paths we take and the paths we leave behind, about the future we are creating with every decision we make, every action we take, every chance we seize or let slip away. Alexander reached for immortality and found only death. But in reaching, he showed us what is possible, what humans can accomplish when they refuse to accept limits, what can be built when ambition and vision and ruthlessness combine in a single individual who believes, truly believes, that nothing is impossible. He was wrong. Many things proved impossible for Alexander, but he came closer to achieving the impossible than almost anyone in history. And if he had lived to 60, we will never know. And perhaps that is fitting. Perhaps some questions should remain unanswered, some paths unexplored, some counterfactuals forever speculative. Because the power of Alexander's story is not in what he did, but in what he might have done. Not in the empire he built, but in the empire he dreamed of building. Not in the world he left behind, but in the world he imagined creating. He died at 32, his greatest conquest still ahead of him in his imagination, his plans for Parthia unfinished, his vision of a united world unrealized, his fusion of cultures barely begun. And in dying young, he became immortal in a way he never expected, not as a god as he hoped, but as a symbol, as a question, as a possibility. What if? What if he had lived? What if we still can? The world Alexander dreamed of, a world united, prosperous, culturally rich, where the barriers between peoples fall away and humanity achieves something greater than the sum of its parts. That world has never existed. But the dream remains, passed down through 23 centuries, inspiring empire builders and revolutionaries, conquerors and reformers, anyone who has ever looked at the world as it is and imagined what it might become. Alexander died, the dream did not. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that is the true legacy of the man who would have been 60 if fate had been kinder. Not the empire he built, which crumbled. Not the cities he founded, most of which are ruins. Not the territories he conquered, which others would conquer in their turn. But the dream, the possibility, the idea that the world can be more than it is, that humanity can transcend its divisions, that we are capable of achieving the impossible if only we are brave enough to try. Alexander was brave enough, and he failed in the ways that mattered most to him. But his failure taught us something important. The dream is worth pursuing even if we cannot achieve it. The attempt matters even if we fall short. The vision is valuable even if we cannot bring it fully into being. He died at 32. He never got his 60 years. He never built the world he imagined. But he showed us it was possible to imagine it, and sometimes that is enough. Sometimes the dream is all we need.